Richard Cromwell, the son of Oliver Cromwell, remains one of the more obscure figures in English history. As the last Lord Protector of the English Commonwealth, his reign was short-lived, lasting just under a year, from 1658 to 1659. His tenure as ruler of England, Scotland, and Ireland was overshadowed by the strength of his father's legacy, as well as the volatile political climate that followed Oliver Cromwell's death. Despite being appointed as his father's successor, Richard Cromwell lacked the political acumen and military prowess of his father and struggled to maintain control over the government. His inability to assert authority led to the collapse of the Protectorate and the eventual restoration of the monarchy under Charles II in 1660. Richard Cromwell was born on October 4, 1626, the second son of Oliver Cromwell and his wife Elizabeth. Richard's upbringing was in stark contrast to that of the English monarchy's heirs. While growing up, he was largely sheltered from the political and military conflicts that characterized the reign of his father. His early life was spent away from the courtly intrigues of London, and Richard had little involvement in the Civil War, unlike his more famous father, who became the central figure in the parliamentary cause. Richard Cromwell received a modest education compared to many of his contemporaries. He was educated at the famous Sidney Sussex College, Cambridge, where he was known to have been a member of the college's Puritan congregation. Richard was not a prominent figure in English politics or military affairs during the Civil War, and his public career before becoming Lord Protector was relatively uneventful. Upon his father's death in 1658, Richard was thrust into the political spotlight when he was appointed as his father's successor. While Oliver Cromwell had risen to power as a general and military leader during the English Civil War, Richard had no military experience of his own. He was more inclined toward intellectual pursuits than the sword, and had little of the commanding presence that had made his father such an influential figure. Despite this, Richard's ascension to the position of Lord Protector came as part of a smooth transition, as the English Republic had no clear system for succession at the time. Oliver Cromwell's death on September 3, 1658, marked the end of an era for the English Commonwealth. His passing left a power vacuum, as there was no clear mechanism in place for selecting a successor. Although Oliver Cromwell had been at the helm of the English Republic for nearly a decade, the political system he had created was inherently unstable. He had ruled as Lord Protector since 1653, and there was no tradition of hereditary monarchy in place to ensure a smooth transition of power. Oliver's choice of Richard as his successor was largely based on familial ties and a desire for continuity. While Oliver had hoped that Richard would be able to maintain control over the military and political factions, this expectation was overly optimistic. Richard's assumption of power was formally confirmed by Parliament, and he was presented with the title of Lord Protector, which had been established by his father's government. However, Richard was never able to match his father's charisma, military expertise, or political acumen. While Oliver Cromwell had dominated the political landscape through a combination of military strength and shrewd statesmanship, Richard lacked these key elements. His appointment was welcomed by many as a symbol of continuity, but it was clear from the outset that he was no match for the challenges he would face as Lord Protector. Richard Cromwell's leadership style was characterized by indecisiveness and a lack of authority. Whereas his father had been a powerful figure who was able to make difficult decisions and command respect, Richard struggled to assert control over both the military and the political factions within the Commonwealth. The military, which had been a key source of power for Oliver Cromwell, was particularly difficult for Richard to manage. The army, composed largely of seasoned veterans from the Civil War, was reluctant to accept the leadership of a man who had no military experience or personal charisma. The political environment during Richard's reign was similarly tumultuous. The Commonwealth had been plagued by internal divisions since the death of Oliver Cromwell, with factions within Parliament vying for power. Richard's government was marked by these divisions, with various groups attempting to pull the country in different directions. There was a growing desire among certain factions to restore the monarchy, and many of the political elite saw Richard as an ineffective figurehead who could not effectively manage the nation's affairs. Moreover, Richard Cromwell lacked the support of the key political institutions of the time, particularly the military and Parliament. His attempts to secure loyalty from the army failed, as many soldiers saw his leadership as weak and ineffective. Richard had no experience in commanding the armed forces, and his inability to assert control over the military was a significant factor in his eventual downfall. Richard was also unable to manage the complex relationship between Parliament and the army. Tensions between these two factions were already high under his father's rule, but they escalated under Richard's leadership. In an attempt to assert more control over the government, Richard dissolved the Rump Parliament in 1659 and called for a new Parliament to be elected. However, this move was unsuccessful, as it was met with resistance from both Parliament and the army. The growing opposition to Richard's rule came to a head in May 1659, when Richard's inability to command the support of the army and Parliament led to his resignation. Faced with mounting pressure and a lack of support, Richard was forced to relinquish power and retire from public life. His resignation marked the end of the Protectorate, and the country quickly descended into political chaos. In the absence of any clear political authority, England was left with no stable form of government, and the monarchy was eventually restored under Charles II in 1660. Richard Cromwell's reign was marked by political instability and a lack of leadership. His failure to maintain control over the army and Parliament ultimately led to the collapse of the Protectorate. While Richard was not directly responsible for the downfall of the Republic, his inability to navigate the complexities of his position contributed to its eventual failure. Richard's resignation in 1659 effectively ended the Protectorate and left England in a state of political turmoil. The Rump Parliament was briefly re-established, but it quickly lost authority, and a new round of negotiations between different political factions began. Richard's departure from power marked the final collapse of the Republican experiment that had begun under his father. This period of instability paved the way for the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II in 1660. After his resignation, Richard Cromwell withdrew from public life and lived in relative obscurity for the rest of his life. He was not prosecuted or exiled, and he was able to live quietly in England, although he was never fully accepted back into the political elite. Richard Cromwell's legacy is largely shaped by his failure to maintain the political structures his father had put in place, and his brief reign is often seen as a symbol of the instability and fragility of the Commonwealth system. Richard Cromwell's legacy is shaped by his inability to live up to the expectations placed upon him. While his father, Oliver Cromwell, had left a powerful and dynamic legacy as Lord Protector, Richard was ill-equipped to maintain that legacy. His reign was characterized by weakness and indecision, and he was unable to navigate the complex political realities of the time. Historians have generally been critical of Richard Cromwell's time in power, emphasizing his failure to secure his position and prevent the collapse of the Protectorate. However, it is important to note that Richard was placed in an incredibly difficult position. He inherited a government that was fragile and deeply divided, and he lacked the personal qualities that had made his father such a formidable leader. Richard's attempts to manage the competing factions within Parliament and the army were unsuccessful, and his inability to assert control over these institutions ultimately led to his downfall.